He was just a man on the sidewalk, ragged, silent, and forgotten. She was just a barista opening her café like any other morning. No one expected the quiet moment between them to ripple across an entire city. But within 24 hours, 8 Marines in full dress uniform would walk through her door without saying a single word and change her life forever. It all started with a pair of untied shoes and someone who chose to kneel when everyone else looked away. Let me tell you the story of what happened next. The morning began like any other at Charleston Roasters. The faint scent of roasted beans drifted through the humid South Carolina air, mixing with the salt carried in from the nearby bay. Outside, the sky was still cloaked in that early dawn gray moo, and the quiet hum of a waking city played softly in the background. A garbage truck turning the corner, a jogger's shoes tapping the sidewalk, the bell over the cafe door jingling faintly in the wind. Mia Roberts arrived just before 5:30, as she always did, not because she had to, but because she wanted a moment of silence before the noise began. She paused on the last step leading up to the front entrance, fishing in her canvas bag for the ring of keys, when something stopped her mid-motion. An old man sat slouched on the bottom step, barely more than a silhouette against the glow of the street lamp. His clothes hung from his frame like a second skin that had weathered too many storms, torn, threadbare, stained by time. His shoes were coming apart at the seams, his socks mismatched and thin as gauze. His hands trembled as he tried over and over to knot the frayed laces. He coughed weakly, every exhale sounding like it was clawing out of his chest. For a moment, Mia stood frozen, not in fear, but in a quiet, invisible tug that pulled her toward him. She set down the box of pastries she had just baked, still warm. Then she knelt, not hesitantly, not as if she was making a grand gesture, but naturally, as though tying the shoes of a stranger in need was the most obvious response in the world. "I've got it," she said gently, her voice low enough to preserve his dignity. Her fingers moved with quiet focus, weaving the laces slowly, carefully, not just to make them tight, but to make them right. The man didn't speak. He didn't look up, but he didn't pull away either. From behind the cafe glass, someone scoffed. Tyler, the new barista, fresh out of college and too eager to impress. A second later, the door burst open behind her. "Hey, stop touching him," Tyler barked, his voice too loud, too sure of itself. "Do you even know what that filthy mess is?" The words echoed in the quiet morning. Inside, a few early customers turned to look. One man chuckled cruelly, sipping his latte. "Better be careful, plain saint. Can't catch kindness like the flu." Mia didn't flinch. She tied the final knot, checked the loop with a soft tug, then stood slowly. She walked inside, ignoring the eyes following her. Moments later, she returned with a steaming cup of coffee and placed it gently beside the man. "I don't know your name," she whispered, "but I know what it's like when your laces keep coming undone. Everybody trips eventually." The man blinked, and for the first time, he met her eyes. Just for a moment, then, without a word, he stood and walked away. His shoes held. Mia Roberts wasn't the kind of woman people noticed twice, not for her clothes, not for her makeup, and certainly not for her job behind a cafe counter. But there was something about her presence, something soft yet rooted, like a willow tree bending in the wind but never breaking. At 26, she carried herself with the quiet assurance of someone who had learned that strength wasn't loud. Each morning at Charleston Roasters, before the sun had fully lifted the shadows from the sidewalks, Mia arrived with her apron folded under one arm and her hair still damp from a quick shower. Regulars adored her, not because she remembered their orders, but because she remembered them. Their names, their allergies, their anniversaries, the small things no one else bothered to ask about. She wasn't fast with a milk frother or flashy with latte art, but her smile, it had a strange power. It made grumpy old men sit up straighter and tired nurses feel like someone had seen them through their fatigue. Yet, behind that smile was a heart often stretched too thin. Her manager, Kevin, never hid his disapproval. "This is a coffee shop, Mia," he'd say with a weary shake of the head. not a shelter, not a counseling center. And every time she offered a day-old croissant to the elderly couple who counted nickels at their table or refilled a to-go cup for someone who had nowhere to go, she braced herself for another lecture. She never argued, she just nodded, and did it again the next time. But truthfully, Mia struggled. It wasn't easy being kind in a world that often confused it with weakness. Her friends told her she was too soft, too emotional, too willing to give people the benefit of the doubt. She'd laugh it off, but sometimes at night, the weight of it all pressed against her ribs like a phantom bruise. She didn't want recognition. She didn't want to be seen as special. What she wanted desperately was to live in a world where small kindnesses didn't feel like rebellion. So she gave what she could, quietly while mopping floors and steaming milk, and when she handed a cup across the counter, she tried to pour a little dignity into it too. She didn't know it yet. But one small act, on one gray morning, would ripple far beyond her understanding, reshaping not only a stranger's final hours, but the entire arc of her own life. By mid-morning, the story had already twisted itself into something else. Tyler, the young barista who'd yelled at Mia earlier, recounted the moment with exaggerated disgust to a group of regulars. She just got on her knees like the guy was royalty or something, he said, laughing. Someone added, he probably hasn't showered in a month and she's down there like it's a fairy tale. The laughter bounced from one table to the next like a dropped coin, clinking hollow in the air. No one mentioned the coffee she had offered. No one noticed how quietly the man had left. Mia heard every word. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She just stood behind the counter, refilling syrup pumps and wiping down mugs that didn't need cleaning. Her hands moved automatically, but her thoughts swirled in a storm of silent defiance and quiet ache. At 11:30, Kevin called her into the office. His tone was cool, corporate, a practiced detachment he'd perfected over years of running a cafe like a machine. Close the door, he said, gesturing to the seat across from his desk. Mia sat. I want to talk about this morning, he began, folding his hands. Look, I know your heart's in the right place and I respect that. But what happened outside created tension. People don't come here to witness scenes like that. They come for coffee and comfort, predictability. I was just helping someone who needed help, Mia replied softly. Kevin sighed. I know. But the guy made customers uncomfortable. That's the problem. I need you to understand boundaries. Next time, if someone like that shows up, direct them to a shelter. Don't get involved. He didn't say dirty. He didn't have to. Mia nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the wood grain of his desk. Understood. She left the office with her shoulders just a little heavier and her chest just a little tighter, but she said nothing because she wasn't sorry. He returned to the espresso machine. Tyler was laughing at something again, his back turned. A customer smiled at her, one of the ones who had laughed earlier. Mia nodded back, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. What none of them knew was that the entire moment, her kneeling, the shouting, the silence that followed, had been caught on a security camera. Every second is recorded. And even more powerful than that lens, someone else had seen. At the back of the cafe, quietly sipping her herbal tea, a retired school teacher named Martha had watched the entire scene unfold. She hadn't laughed, she hadn't looked away, and as she glanced down at her phone that morning, a simple thought struck her. This girl just reminded me of what humanity looks like. So she pressed record, and she hit save. That night, while the cafe wound down under flickering overhead lights and the scent of day-old espresso, Martha sat in her apartment across town, hands still shaking slightly from what she had witnessed that morning. She was no stranger to injustice. 32 years as a public school teacher had taught her that some people are always looked through, not at. But something about Mia's gesture, quiet, undramatic, almost invisible, had pierced through the noise of her ordinary day. On instinct, she pulled up the video she had recorded. Mia kneeling, the boy shouting, the man not moving, the silence that followed. She watched it again and again, her heart tightening with each replay. Her son, a veteran who had served 2 tours in Iraq, called her that night like he always did on Tuesdays. But when he asked about her day, Martha didn't start with the weather or her aching knees. She started with the video. By 10 p.m., that same clip had been posted to a Facebook group called Veterans of Charleston with a simple caption. He may be homeless, but that doesn't mean he's nobody. The video struck a nerve, not just with strangers, but with brothers. Within hours, hundreds of comments flooded the post. One gray-haired veteran named Daniel paused mid-scroll, his breath catching when the man's face came into frame. He leaned closer to the screen, heart hammering. Then he typed, "That looks like Marcus Bell. Served with me in Fallujah, haven't seen him in over a decade." Another user tagged Bell's former unit commander. The comment thread became a digital roll call. Names, ranks, memories. Piecing together the fragments of a man they had all somehow lost track of. A man who once carried 3 wounded Marines across open fire without hesitation, whose hands had shaken not out of fear, but from holding too much grief. They had all heard the rumors Bell had struggled with PTSD after returning, withdrawn from his unit, then vanished into the cracks of a system that had no room for quiet heroes with loud memories. Now here he was in a viral video, his shoes tied by a stranger, his dignity restored, not by medals, but by eye contact. At 8:00 p.m. that same evening, across town, an ambulance arrived at the entrance of the community health center. Marcus Bell had been found slumped over on a park bench, his breath shallow, his skin pale. He was admitted in silence, nameless. The nurses didn't know about the war stories or the laughter he used to share in the barracks. They only knew he was fading. By 9:17 p.m., despite everything they tried, Marcus Bell passed away. The diagnosis, respiratory failure, complicated by untreated pneumonia, made worse by years of sleeping in cold corners no one claimed, but there was more to it than medical terms. Marcus had been unraveling for years, invisible in a country he once bled for. And yet, in the plastic bag that held the few things he owned, the nurses found 3 items. A tattered Marine Corps ID, a faded photograph, and a clean pair of socks folded with care. Inside the sock was a note written in fragile, trembling handwriting. "Thank you for seeing me as a person." The night was quiet when Marcus Bell left this world. Not with the sound of gunfire or chaos, but with a long, hollow breath that slipped unnoticed past the machines. No family gathered by his bedside, no priest murmured final words, no bugle played. He died under fluorescent lights in a city he had once defended, wearing the same worn shoes Mia had tied for him that morning. It would have ended there, just another anonymous case in the city's overwhelmed shelter system, had it not been for the nurse, who, while cataloging his belongings, opened the folded socks and found the note. She paused, reading the shaking lines again. "Thank you for seeing me as a person." The weight of it hit her. She had seen plenty of final notes, desperate scribbles, unfinished thoughts, but this one was different. It was full, it was complete. It wasn't about dying, it was about being seen. She handed the note to her supervisor. That supervisor had seen the video the night before. Within an hour, calls were being made, files were pulled, and Marcus Bell was no longer anonymous. The Veterans Affairs Office confirmed his identity. His name unlocked records, military service, commendations, and a Bronze Star for Valor. His name triggered calls to retired officers from a former unit. His name began to echo. By midnight, the news had reached every Marine in Charleston who had ever laced up beside Marcus Bell. What hurt most wasn't that he had died. It was that they hadn't known he was alive. He had carried men through hell in Fallujah, had stopped bleeding with his bare hands, had made battlefield promises he never broke. but no one had noticed when he disappeared into alleyways and shelters and park benches.
Yes.
Now they knew, and the shame of forgetting weighed heavier than the medals on their chests. One of those men, the same staff sergeant who once owed Marcus his life, didn't sleep that night. He cleaned his uniform. He polished his boots. He gathered his team. "We don't leave our own behind," he said simply. And though Marcus had been left behind for years, they would not let him leave this world unnoticed. Before dawn broke the next morning, they moved. No trumpet, no media alert, no ceremony. Just 8 Marines moving with purpose, assembling with quiet precision. At the foot of a café where a girl had knelt when no one else would, they planned to honor not just the man Marcus Bell had been, but the humanity Mia had returned to him in his final hours. He had died nameless. He had died seen. And that changed everything. Mia was wiping down a table near the front window when she heard it. A low, synchronized rumble that didn't sound like morning traffic. At first, no one paid it any mind. A few customers sipped coffee, tapping on laptops or scrolling through phones. The sun had just begun to warm the sidewalks, and the usual hum of Charleston's daily rhythm filled the air. Then the noise grew louder, a gravel, deep hum of engines that sounded intentional. 3 military jeeps came into view, followed by a black SUV, its back window barely visible under the cloth draped over it. People turned toward the sound, craning their necks. Mia looked up. The jeeps pulled directly in front of Charleston Roasters and came to a perfect sudden stop. Doors opened in unison. 8 Marines in full dress blues stepped out, tall, silent, immaculately pressed, forming 2 lines of 4. Their medals glinted against crisp uniforms. Their boots struck the pavement like punctuation marks. Time stilled. Inside, a customer set down his drink without finishing his sip. The espresso machine hissed and then fell quiet. Tyler stopped mid-joke. Kevin opened his office door and froze at the threshold. And the door swung open. The Marines entered in perfect formation, 2 lines moving as one, solemn, deliberate, purposeful. They didn't glance at the customers, didn't break stride. Every movement echoed discipline, honor, and weight. Mia stood at the counter, cloth still in hand. As the lead Marine approached, recognition slowly crept into her eyes, but she couldn't speak. His staff sergeant stopped directly in front of her. In one graceful motion, he placed a perfectly folded American flag on the counter. Beside it, a small wooden box, polished and engraved with the Marine Corps emblem. Then, from inside his jacket, he drew an envelope, weathered and sealed by hand. His voice was calm, but it carried through the hushed café like a bell in fog. "We're not here for coffee," he said. "We're here to thank you." Mia blinked, her breath caught in her throat. I didn't do anything," she whispered. He placed the envelope in her hand. On the front, in shaky lettering, "For the girl who tied my shoes, thank you." She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside, a single page, written with effort and honesty. "For 17 years, no one looked me in the eye. You did. Not because my coat was torn, but because I needed my shoes tied. I no longer have the strength to hold a rifle, but yesterday, I stood tall for the first time in years." Marcus Bell. Mia's eyes filled with tears. Another Marine stepped forward. "Sergeant Marcus Bell carried 4 men through live fire in Fallujah. He was awarded the Bronze Star, but yesterday you gave him something no medal ever could. You gave him back his dignity." Silence fell again, not empty, but heavy with meaning. One by one, each Marine approached. Each placed a challenge coin beside the flag. Each delivered a crisp, silent salute. Not to a barista, but to a woman who had, without fanfare, knelt where the world stood back. The final Marine, older than the rest, removed his cover and spoke softly. In his final hours, Marcus told a nurse something we want you to hear. He said, "That girl was the first person in 17 years who didn't see my dirt before she saw me. Mia lowered her head, tears tracing silent paths down her face. And the cafe which had laughed the day before now sat in stunned stillness. No one laughed this time. No one dared. The cafe never quite returned to normal after that morning. Even as the Marines quietly exited in perfect formation, even after the rumble of their vehicles faded into the Charleston streets, the silence lingered, thick, reverent. The flag and wooden box remained on the counter like an altar. And Mia? She didn't move. Kevin stepped out from the back office, his face pale and unreadable, his eyes flicked between the folded flag, the tears on Mia's cheeks, and the now silent customers who couldn't quite meet her gaze. He approached, hesitantly. "Mia," he said, his voice small for the first time. "I had no idea." She didn't look at him. "I was wrong," he added, awkward, stiff. "And if you'd let me, we could promote you full-time, maybe even manager." But Mia had already made her decision. That afternoon, she typed up her resignation and left it on Kevin's desk without fanfare. No farewell post, no goodbye drinks with coworkers, just a clean break, like turning a page that was too full of the wrong story. There was no anger in her exit, only clarity. 3 days later, she stood beneath the gray skies of the National Cemetery, the only civilian among rows of Marines in dress uniform. Marcus Bell's funeral was simple. No elaborate eulogies, no slideshow of old photographs, just brothers in arms gathered around a flag-draped casket, saluting the man they had once fought beside and somehow lost along the way. Mia didn't bring flowers. She brought the note he had written her, folded, now framed in her memory. On his headstone, the words were simple. "Was seen." After the service, the same staff sergeant approached her again. His eyes were red-rimmed, but steady. "Marcus had no next of kin," he said quietly. "The Corps was his family. But somewhere along the way, we failed him." Mia didn't speak, only listened. "If you hadn't seen him, if you hadn't done what you did, he would have died without a name." She nodded, her voice thick with held-in sorrow. "But now, he doesn't have to be forgotten." That evening, Mia walked the long path home through a quiet city that suddenly felt different. Not smaller, but more fragile. Everything around her could be broken if ignored long enough. She didn't sleep much that night, but what kept her awake wasn't grief. It was the purpose. 2 weeks later, beneath the shade of a weathered oak in a quiet city park, Mia opened a modest wooden kiosk. No big sign, no opening ceremony, just a hand-painted name on the front. The Second String. It offered free socks, refurbished shoes, hot coffee, no questions. No judgment. Just dignity, folded and waiting. Every morning before sunrise, Mia arrived at the little kiosk beneath the oak tree. It wasn't much, just a wooden stand with shelves and a small table where people could sit for a moment without being asked to leave. The world passed by in its usual rush, joggers, buses, and office workers grabbing their morning lattes. But under that tree, time moved differently. There was no register, no price tags. On one shelf sat a neat stack of clean socks, on another, shoes, some new, some gently used, all restored with care. And in the corner, a thermos of hot coffee and a row of mismatched mugs, none of them identical, but all of them clean. Above it all, pinned on a small wooden board, was a folded American flag. Next to it, laminated and framed, the last note Marcus Bell had ever written. "Thank you for seeing me as a person." She didn't advertise, didn't live stream, didn't hashtag. She just showed up. And slowly people did too. A woman in scrubs who had been skipping meals between shifts. A teenage boy whose shoes were 2 sizes too small. A retired veteran who never took anything but came just to sit beside the socks and talk about the weather. And sometimes, just sometimes, one of the old Marines who had saluted her that day would stop by, not for help, but to leave something. a bag of new socks, a freshly cleaned pair of boots, a thermos full of coffee. No, no names, just silent offerings on sacred ground. 6 months after she opened, a local reporter showed up with a notepad and a microphone, curious about the strange little station tucked between trees. "You gave up a steady job for this?" he asked. "Why?" Mia didn't answer right away. Instead, she pointed to the wall behind her, to the note, the flag, the shelf. "Because some debts can't be repaid," she said, "but they can be passed forward." And that was all. On the anniversary of Marcus's passing, she arrived to find something waiting at the door of the kiosk. 8 pairs of perfectly polished dress shoes were placed side by side in a single, solemn row. No note, no announcement, no need. The Marines remembered, and so did she. She knelt beside them, gently brushing off a single speck of dust from one of the shoes. Then she stood, placed a fresh pair of socks on the top shelf, and poured the first cup of coffee for the day. That morning, just before the sun cleared the rooftops, she whispered, not to anyone in particular, "Rest easy, Sergeant Bell, I see you still."